Help! I am lost in John Woo's America. John Woo is one of my favorite directors, honestly, and I think he's by far the greatest action filmmaker of all time. And I've been rewatching his American films, and most recently I revisited Hard Target 1993, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, Lance Henriksen, and Arnold Vosloo. Wonderfully plays a henchman, one of the best henchmen of all time. Actually, John Woo's really good at having henchmen, because Mad Dog and Hard Boiled is right on up there with Arnold Vosloo's character in Hard Target. There's a part where like a very unlikable fat man is sleeping, and it slowly pans over and shows Arnold Vosloo, who played the Mummy, in case you're kind of wondering who he was in the Brendan Fraser films. And he's standing over his bed and he just goes, because karate chops his goddamn stomach. And it's just, I had to rewind it like 50 times. It was hilarious. Yes, John Woo is a director who I think makes hilarious films that are also dripping with absolute brilliance. And I think it's very interesting to see what John Woo's America looks like. Now, basically everything is carried over from his Chinese pictures, like the classics, Hard Boiled, The Killer, Better Tomorrow. Things are carried over most certainly from there. You still have the Martin Scorsese-inspired slow motion, that slow-mo meaning to kind of make moments more cinematic, and by proxy of making them more cinematic, making them more holy, making them holier, and, you know, also counterintuitively exposing the impermanence of time itself. So the slow-mo of Martin Scorsese still carries over, and the freeze frames from Truffaut, like Jules and Jim, to burn expressions, moments in time into your brain, carries over too. Those two things actually balance each other out stylistically rather perfectly, and that's a remarkable acuteness on John Woo's part to really meld those two together. And of course his ballistic, hyperkinetic action scenes, operatic, full of spiritual dimensions, overwhelming spiritual dimensions. In fact, you would say absolutely smothered and drowning in too many spiritual dimensions, but I think it's just right. John Woo's America. So this was Hard Target. Was John Woo's first American film, and beyond that, it was the first mainstream Hollywood film that a Chinese director has ever made, and Hollywood did not trust John Woo whatsoever. In fact, they sent Sam Raimi down to the set of Hard Target to kind of supervise him and make sure that he's doing fine, and it sounds weird that Sam Raimi would even agree to do that, but he has a quote that completely redeems him of all like implicit condemnation. He said, look, he's doing fine. John Woo at 70% is better than, like, most or any Hollywood filmmakers at 100. What this guy's doing is extraordinary, and what he did was extraordinary. I love Hard Target. It's one of the funniest films. It's one of the most striking films, unintentional or not. And Jean-Claude Van Damme, I am shameless Jean-Claude fan. The Muscles from Brussels has a fan forever in me. I think he's wonderful here as this ridiculous Cajun standing up for homeless rights and homeless vets and things like that. I think that the film is extraordinary. I think it's extraordinarily well put together, because you could laugh at the unintentional humor. Sure, but that doesn't mean that John Woo failed, because while you're laughing at the unintentional humor, you are completely swept away in the hyperkinetics of the ballistic gunfights, of the ballet of bullets, of the complete ceremony of blood. It's completely a blizzard, a tornado of action. And these action sequences are incredible, but what does John Woo's America represent? So I mentioned he carried everything over, and then he amplified them. And that's to be expected. He amplified the most, the loudest qualities possessed by The Killer or Hard Boiled or Bullet in the Head. He amplified all of those qualities, turned them up to 11, in a matter of speaking. But what I find a lot more interesting is that there's also a much greater unrealism and hyperliteralism to his American films, to Hard Target, Broken Arrow, Face Off, Mission Impossible 2. There's a heightened unrealism and an inherent literalism. So the doves meaning spiritual salvation, meaning it's supposed to dictate a spiritual dimension to a certain decision being made or a certain action taking place. And in The Killer and Hard Boiled, it wasn't as hyper-literal as it was in Hard Target or like Mission Impossible 2. In those, it's not only to denote spiritual dimensions to any given scene, it's also supposed to really highlight the heroism, like these suburban kids with biblical names kind of idea. It is elevating these American stars into the biblical heroes, into the myths that they self-mythologize themselves to be. And it's a hyper-literalization of still a loud metaphor, but it still was at least a metaphor with some kind of notion of nuance when it was in China. When it comes to America, that nuance is non-existent anymore, and it's more a highlighter. In fact, he pulls an Ingmar Bergman on us by putting subtext where the main narrative should actually be. So that metaphor is on top of the narrative, and it's impossible to miss its true meaning and its true definitions. And the unrealism, I would also say that his violence is also ramped up and amplified, but his violence even seems to have direct beyond biblical dimensions, beyond spiritual and Christian dimensions, like what was visible in The Killer or Hard Boiled. These have direct spiritual connections. Hard Target, I believe he is deliberately angling it as some kind of hyperkinetic and a biblical story with a southern twang that John Woo believes is truly American. Because what John Woo believes is truly American is also what is truly cinematic. So what John Woo thinks of America, he thinks of America in cinematic terms. But for John Woo, just like with Martin Scorsese and Francois Truffaut, as we mentioned earlier, his big influences, and Melville, too, a huge influence of John Woo, what it meant for all four of these kinds of filmmakers, to be cinematic is also to be holy. To be cinematic is to be in a world of biblical revelation. To be cinematic is to be saintly, is to be bringing a message, a gospel, bringing some good news, some holy good news. So, John Woo, America is a holy place. It's a sort of Hollywood land, promised land. To John Woo, everything inside of America is biblical, is unending, is cinematic, and therefore is Christ-like. And how John Woo expresses his devotion to his ideation of God is through these, like I said, a complete torrent, a complete blizzard of bullets and a ballet of blood. And this is absolutely insanity. Hard Target is a complete hoedown. Is a hoedown just covered in ultra-violence and gore. And amazing choreography and acrobatics, but that should go without saying. That should just be blatantly true of the work of John Woo. John Woo's America, seeing America through John Woo's eyes, through that kind of action god lens, is quite astounding because, like I said, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Hard Target is this amazing film of physical poetry, that it's incredibly poetic and it's going to change your life. It most likely won't, and I'd be kind of concerned if it did. But what I am going to say is that it's a completely fascinating film to really view America through someone's eyes who understands it in completely cinematic terms and wants to kind of baptize it in a holy kind of cinematic, baptism. He wants to baptize it in some sort of cinematic purification, is exactly what John Woo wants to do. He wants to purify the cinema, and by extension of that, and by proxy of that, because as we've said, he views cinema in holy terms, and he views America in a holy way. By proxy of that, he wants to make America that kind of holy divine place that he sees in his head. But of course, this holy and divine place is characterized by mad dog gunmen, by crazy explosions, by insane one-liners, by cheesy, holy dialogue. Like, it's absolutely incredible that a statement as grand and as, like, kind of honestly, philosophically, at least in a purely cinematic sense and form, striking and interesting to kind of examine, could be made into something as campy, as unintentionally high octane, as as something like Hard Target, as something like Face Off, but there is something completely fascinating about watching John Woo, the great cinematic purifier, the great cinematic baptizer. He's like John the Baptist. He is our John the Baptist, essentially. And watching what he does with these, with American iconography, with purely American iconography, singularly American icons and myths, and what he does to them is he makes them even larger than they already were. They were already something beyond themselves, and what John Woo does to these archetypes and icons is that he molds them and turns them into something that he considers holy and nearly untouchable, nearly unknowable in any sort of kind of rational discourse. I love John Woo. I love his America. I don't love these cheap-ass things keep going out every 5 seconds, and I'm sure you guys don't either. That's usually where quick cuts are done, but I don't have editing, so... You know, that's what we're stuck with. John Woo is an absolute, master. He's an absolute master, but he's also someone who I can look at and go, these films aren't going to change your life. What they're going to do is give you the best damn hour and a half to 2 hours that you've ever had. It's going to be incredible. I love John Woo. I love getting lost in his America. His hyperkinetics are extraordinary, and he's a completely compelling filmmaker. He's the best action filmmaker of all time, too, because action should be over-exaggerated. Action should be a holy kind of genre. It should be a kind of divine genre. It really should, because that's when it's at its best. It's at its best when it is almost a biblical idea of good and evil, and the idea of... I like that he brings in the kind of Eastern sensibility to the idea of good and evil as well, that it exists inside of both of us, that kind of thing. But ultimately, people are more good than they are evil, and others are more evil than they are good. It's a minor complication, but it's one that's completely necessary in order to completely express his kind of just biblical explosion of images, just beautiful images. Just, this is a beautiful director, and I've been really enjoying revisiting his American work, which is vastly undervalued when compared to his Chinese work, and I understand why. But John Woo's America is something that should be deeply examined, should be deeply studied, it should be dissected and analyzed, because his idea, his version, his visualization of America is kind of astounding to me, and it's completely fascinating and remarkably unique. Never seen this kind of interpretation of America before. I want to thank you guys for watching. Go watch a John Woo movie. You won't regret it. It's how could you regret it? It's just a completely exciting, gripping, entertaining experience. Thank you guys for watching. My name is Zachary Conan. Subscribe to the channel, like, comment, share. Yeah, in the comments, what do you think of John Woo's American films? Do you consider them guilty pleasures? Because I don't. I'm completely upfront about how much I enjoy his films, even in America, and I think of them in incredibly high regard. I hold them in an incredibly high esteem. Masterful films from a masterful director that aren't that you really can't place, that you really can't position anywhere, even in the realm of cheesy 90s action films, which I love. I love that time period and those genre films. You really can't neatly and nicely place John Woo into that kind of a subcategory of films. He exists in his own universe, even when he is lost inside his own ideation, his own ideal of America, and even when he's actually in America. It's fascinating. A fascinating filmmaker, and the discussions, let's start a discourse. Let's have a talk in the comments about John Woo. Thank you so much for watching my videos, as always. That's like greatly appreciated to me. I couldn't tell you how much I appreciate it enough that you guys are watching my rants, my ramblings, my analysis, my critiques, and my worship of certain filmmakers, certain stars, certain genres, certain films. Thank you so much. Name's Zachary Conan.